August 31st, 1980, the Church of the Good Shepherd in Beverly Hills. Karen Carpenter, 30 years old, one of the most beloved and commercially successful voices in American pop music, marries Thomas James Burris, a real estate developer she had known for only about a year. The wedding drew hundreds of guests and was, by every account of the day itself, a lavish, joyful affair, one of the more widely covered celebrity weddings of that particular year in the entertainment press. Karen looked radiant. The gossip columns treated the marriage as a fairy tale ending for a woman whose public image had long been built around wholesome, all-American sweetness, the kind of story entertainment reporters of the era were eager to run without asking many further questions. 14 months later, the marriage was completely and irrevocably over. 2 years after that, Karen Carpenter was dead. The public narrative that eventually formed around her death centered almost entirely on her long, well-documented struggle with anorexia nervosa, a struggle that had been part of her life and her family's private concern for years before she ever met Tom Burris. What gets left out of that narrative far more often than it should is what actually happened inside that 14-month marriage and how directly connected it was to the final catastrophic decline of her health. To understand what Tom Burris actually represented to Karen Carpenter, you have to understand where she was in her life and career when she met him. By the late 1970s, Karen and her brother Richard had spent most of the decade as one of the most commercially dominant acts in American popular music, the Carpenters selling tens of millions of records built around Karen's extraordinary, instantly recognizable contralto voice. The duo had scored a remarkable run of hits throughout the early and mid-1970s, songs like Close to You, Rainy Days and Mondays, and Superstar, establishing them as one of the defining sounds of the era's soft pop landscape, even as critics at the time sometimes dismissed their polished, wholesome image in favor of harder-edged contemporaries. But by 1979, the partnership was under serious strain. Richard was dealing with a dependency on prescription sedatives that would eventually require him to enter treatment, effectively pausing the duo's output. Karen, meanwhile, had spent years struggling with body image and disordered eating that had become, by the late 1970s, a serious and visible health crisis, one that band members, family, and industry colleagues had all separately tried and largely failed to address. She was, by multiple biographers' accounts, including Randy Schmidt's extensively researched 2010 biography, Little Girl Blue, desperately looking for some form of stability and identity outside the increasingly strained Carpenters' partnership, and in 1979, she moved to New York to record a solo album, a rare act of independence from the family business that had defined her entire adult life. That solo album project itself is worth noting, because it represents one of the few periods in Karen's adult life where she pursued something explicitly outside the Carpenters brand, working with outside producers and musicians in New York, rather than the familiar Los Angeles studio environment she and Richard had used for years. Biographers have generally treated this period as evidence of a woman actively searching for an identity separate from the sibling act that had defined her public image since her early 20s, a search that, according to multiple accounts, made her particularly receptive to the promise of a stable, independent domestic life when Tom Burris entered the picture shortly afterward. It was during this period of searching, according to Schmidt's biography and other contemporaneous accounts, that Karen was introduced to Tom Burris through mutual friends in Los Angeles real estate and entertainment circles. Burris was 9 years older than Karen, divorced, with 2 children from his previous marriage, and presented himself as a successful, established real estate developer. He was, by numerous accounts from people who knew both of them, charming, attentive, and seemingly exactly the kind of grounded, non-industry partner that friends and family had hoped Karen might eventually find, someone whose life didn't revolve around the entertainment business the way virtually everyone else in her orbit did. The courtship moved quickly. Karen and Tom became engaged within months of meeting, and biographers who have reconstructed this period, drawing on interviews with people close to Karen at the time, describe a woman who was, by every visible sign, thrilled and hopeful about the relationship, seeing in it a path toward the domestic life and family she had spoken about wanting for years, a desire that stood in some tension with the demands of her ongoing career. Friends interviewed for Schmidt's biography recalled Karen speaking enthusiastically about wanting children, describing marriage to Tom as an opportunity to build a life that felt, for the first time in years, like it might belong entirely to her rather than to the Carpenters as a commercial enterprise. The pace of the courtship itself, in retrospect, has been treated by several biographers as a warning sign that went largely unheeded at the time. Karen and Tom's engagement was announced only a matter of months after they had begun seeing each other regularly, a timeline considerably faster than the courtships of people around her had typically unfolded, and one that left relatively little time for the kind of due diligence, financial or personal, that might have surfaced some of the misrepresentations that would later come to define the marriage. People close to Karen at the time have described her as swept up in the momentum of the relationship in a way that was, by multiple accounts, uncharacteristic of her generally cautious and detail-oriented personality in other areas of her life, particularly her meticulous approach to her own recording career. What Karen did not know, and what emerged only after the marriage had already begun to unravel, was that Tom Burris had undergone a vasectomy years before they met and had never disclosed this to her. This detail, confirmed across multiple biographical accounts, including Schmidt's book and subsequent interviews with people close to the Carpenter family, is one of the starkest and most consequential facts of the entire marriage. Karen, who had told friends and family repeatedly how much she wanted to have children, discovered only after the wedding that the possibility had been foreclosed to her from the very beginning by a decision her husband had made years earlier and chosen not to share with her before she committed her life to him. Biographers and people close to Karen at the time have described this discovery as devastating to her, in a way that went beyond ordinary marital disappointment, striking directly at one of the primary reasons she had entered the marriage in the first place. The financial picture of the marriage compounds this betrayal considerably. Tom Burris had presented himself as a successful real estate developer, and multiple accounts describe a lifestyle in the early stages of the relationship consistent with that image. Expensive homes, an active social life among Los Angeles' entertainment and business elite. But according to Schmidt's biography and corroborating reporting done in the years following Karen's death, Burris's actual financial situation was considerably more precarious than he had represented, and over the course of the marriage, Karen's own money, earned through years of grueling touring and recording as one half of an internationally successful act, was drawn on extensively to cover expenses connected to Burris's business dealings and lifestyle. And the precise scale of the financial drain has never been fully documented in public record, since much of it was handled through private settlements after the marriage ended, but multiple people close to Karen at the time, cited across several biographical accounts, described her growing increasingly aware during the marriage that she was, in practical terms, financially supporting a man who had misrepresented both his fertility and his financial stability to her before she agreed to marry him. The specific nature of Burris's financial misrepresentation extended, according to some accounts, beyond simple overstatement of his success into more direct financial entanglement with Karen's own resources, with several biographers noting that significant sums were transferred from Karen's accounts during the marriage toward business ventures and obligations that were substantially, if not entirely, Burris's own. This pattern, once it became clear to Karen and to the people managing her business affairs, added a further layer of betrayal on top of the earlier discovery about his fertility, transforming what had begun as a personal deception about family planning into a broader pattern of financial exploitation that people close to her at the time have described as deeply destabilizing. During an already fragile period of her health and personal life, the wedding itself, for all its outward grandeur, was reportedly troubled even in its planning. According to accounts collected by Schmidt and other researchers, Karen's own family expressed reservations about the pace of the relationship and about Burris himself in the months leading up to the ceremony. Concerns that Karen, eager for the stability and family life the marriage represented, largely set aside. The wedding proceeded as planned in August 1980, drawing significant media coverage given Karen's fame, and for a period afterward, the public narrative remained the one the wedding itself had projected. A beloved singer had finally found personal happiness after years focused entirely on her career. That public narrative diverged sharply from what biographers have since pieced together about the actual texture of the marriage's brief existence. Multiple accounts describe a relationship that deteriorated rapidly once the initial period of the courtship's momentum wore off, with Karen discovering not only the vasectomy but a broader pattern of misrepresentation about who Tom Burris actually was and what he had actually built. Friends interviewed for various retrospective accounts of Karen's life described her confiding, within months of the wedding, that she felt she had made a serious mistake, that the man she had married bore little resemblance to the version of himself he had presented during their courtship. The specific nature of some of these disclosures, according to people close to Karen at the time, extended to allegations of infidelity during the marriage as well, allegations that were never legally adjudicated, but that multiple sources close to the family have described as consistent with the broader pattern of dishonesty Karen discovered after the wedding. The honeymoon period of the marriage, brief as it was, has itself become a point of biographical interest, precisely because of how quickly it gave way to disillusionment. Accounts collected from people who spent time with the couple in the earliest months of the marriage describe a Karen who remained publicly upbeat and committed to the relationship even as private doubts appeared to mount, a pattern consistent with what those who knew her well described as her lifelong tendency to project competence and control to the outside world, regardless of what was actually happening beneath the surface. The same tendency that had, for years, made it difficult for even close friends and family to recognize the full severity of her eating disorder until it had become physically undeniable. What makes this period genuinely dark, rather than simply another unhappy celebrity marriage that ended in divorce, is how directly biographers and people close to Karen have connected the collapse of this relationship to the final, most severe phase of her eating disorder. Karen's struggle with anorexia predated the relationship with Tom Burris by several years, first becoming seriously visible to people around her in the mid-1970s, and it had already caused serious health complications well before she met him. But multiple accounts, including Schmidt's biography and reflections given by Richard Carpenter and other family members in interviews conducted after Karen's death, described the marriage's rapid unraveling, the discovery of the vasectomy, the financial strain, and the broader sense of having been fundamentally deceived by someone she had trusted with her future, as a period that coincided with the severe worsening of her physical and psychological health. The specific mechanisms of an eating disorder are complex and rarely reducible to any single external cause, and no reputable account claims the marriage alone caused Karen's illness. But the timeline itself is difficult to look past. A woman who had spent years in a difficult, partially managed struggle with her health entered a marriage hoping it would provide stability and a path toward the family life she wanted. Discovered within months that fundamental aspects of her husband's life had been concealed from her. And by the time she separated from Burris in late 1981, her health had deteriorated to a degree that alarmed even the people who had already been watching her condition closely for years. Karen and Tom Burris separated in November 1981, roughly 14 months after the wedding, though their formal divorce was not finalized until shortly before her death in 1983. A detail that meant Karen spent much of the final period of her life still legally married to a man from whom she had already emotionally and physically separated. That prolonged legal limbo has itself drawn attention from biographers, who note that the drawn-out nature of the divorce proceedings, connected in part to the financial entanglements that had built up over the course of the marriage, meant Karen was unable to fully close the chapter, even as she attempted to move forward with treatment and with rebuilding her career, carrying the unresolved legal and financial weight of the marriage alongside the more immediate work of trying to save her own health. According to accounts from people close to her during this final period, Karen threw herself back into her career and into an intensive effort to address her declining health, seeking treatment in New York with a therapist specializing in eating disorders during 1982, a period biographers have generally treated as one of the more hopeful stretches of her final years, one in which she appeared, according to friends and family who saw her during visits home, to be making real progress. She had reportedly begun regaining some of the physical strength that years of illness had eroded, and people who spoke with her during this period described a woman who seemed genuinely engaged in the process of recovery, discussing plans for future recording projects and expressing optimism about rebuilding both her health and her career in the wake of the marriage's collapse. That progress, tragically, proved insufficient to reverse years of accumulated physical damage. Karen Carpenter died on February 4, 1983, at her parents' home in Downey, California, at the age of 32. The medical examiner's report listed the cause of death as heart failure brought on by complications of anorexia nervosa, specifically connected to the damage caused to her heart muscle by the ongoing strain of her illness. Her death became one of the most widely publicized cases of anorexia nervosa in American history, credited by many public health researchers and eating disorder specialists with significantly raising public and medical awareness of a condition that had, prior to her death, received comparatively little serious attention in mainstream American medicine and media, prompting a wave of subsequent research funding and public health messaging that specialists in the field have since credited, in part, with improving early detection and treatment access for patients diagnosed in the years that followed. In the years since, The public memory of Karen Carpenter's death has understandably centered overwhelmingly and almost exclusively on the eating disorder itself, treated as the singular, defining fact of her final years, a framing reinforced by extensive subsequent medical and cultural discussion of anorexia nervosa that used her case as a reference point. What has received considerably less sustained attention in comparison is the marriage that occupied the final years before her death, and that, according to the people who were actually present for it, played a significant role in the acceleration of her decline. Tom Burris himself gave few public statements about the marriage in the years following Karen's death, and biographers researching the relationship have generally had to rely on the accounts of Karen's family, friends, and colleagues rather than any sustained account from Burris himself, a silence that has left much of the marriage's interior life documented secondhand rather than through the direct testimony of the person whose deception, by multiple accounts, did so much to define it. This asymmetry in the documentary record, Karen's side extensively chronicled through decades of biographical research, and Burris's side almost entirely absent from the public account, has itself shaped how the marriage has been remembered, or rather, how thoroughly it has been forgotten relative to its apparent significance in her final years. Cultural retrospectives of Karen Carpenter's life and death, including television documentaries and the widely discussed 1989 television film The Karen Carpenter Story, have generally treated the Burris marriage briefly, often compressing it into a few minutes of a much longer narrative focused primarily on her career and her illness. A compression that, according to biographers who have spent considerably more time reconstructing the marriage's details, understates how central the relationship's collapse appears to have been to the final, most dangerous phase of her health decline. Richard Carpenter, in interviews given across the decades since his sister's death, has spoken about the marriage with visible restraint, generally acknowledging that it was a deeply unhappy period for Karen without elaborating extensively on the specific details of Burris's deceptions, a reticence biographers have attributed both to ordinary family privacy and to Richard's broader, long-documented discomfort with public discussion of his sister's private struggles. He has, in some of the more extended interviews given for retrospective documentaries about the Carpenters, described the marriage in general terms as a source of significant additional stress during a period when Karen's health was already precarious, without going into the specific financial or personal details that biographers have since assembled from other sources close to the family. Agnes Carpenter, Karen and Richard's mother, whose own relationship with Karen has itself been the subject of considerable biographical scrutiny and debate regarding its role in Karen's psychological struggles more broadly, was reportedly deeply opposed to Burris even before the wedding took place. According to multiple accounts, though the precise nature and intensity of that opposition, and whether Karen's eagerness to marry despite it, reflected a desire for independence from her mother's control as much as genuine affection for Burris himself, remains a subject biographers continue to debate without full resolution. What makes the Tom Burris chapter of Karen Carpenter's life worth examining in detail, rather than treating as a footnote to the eating disorder that ultimately killed her, is precisely this connection between deception and decline. A woman who had spent her entire adult life in the unusually exposed position of a chart-topping public figure, whose body and image had been subject to constant public and industry commentary for over a decade, entered a marriage specifically hoping to build something private, stable, and entirely her own, a family life outside the reach of the commercial machine that had defined her since her early 20s. What she got instead, according to the substantial body of biographical evidence assembled in the decades since her death, was a husband who had concealed a permanent foreclosing decision about the one thing she had said she wanted most, alongside a broader pattern of financial and personal misrepresentation that left her, within little more than a year, having to rebuild not just her health but her basic trust in the people closest to her, during precisely the period when both were most fragile. The marriage's darkness, in other words, isn't a separate story from the eating disorder that eventually killed Karen Carpenter. It's arguably the final decisive chapter of the same story. The moment when a woman already fighting for years to manage a severe and dangerous illness entered what she believed would be a source of stability, and instead discovered a fundamental betrayal at the center of it. One that, according to the people who knew her best during those final years, she never fully recovered from before her death, less than 2 years after the marriage's collapse. The wedding photographs from August 1980 show a woman who looked, by every outward measure, happier than she had in years. The full record of what happened in the 14 months that followed tells a considerably darker and more complicated story, one that the public narrative around Karen Carpenter's death has, for more than 4 decades, largely left in the background, overshadowed by the more visible, more extensively documented, but not entirely separate story of the illness that ultimately took her life at 32, less than 18 months after her divorce from Tom Burris was finally made legally official.